So she just start to come in.
Hi, everyone. Thank you all for joining us. I am Matthew Silverman, the Executive Director of the Haberman Institute for Jewish Studies, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to our program titled, What is Philip Roth's Legacy as a Jewish Writer? With Dr. Jacques Berlinerblau. I am intrigued to learn with Dr. Berlinerblau this evening as he discusses Philip Roth's complex Jewish identity and how it impacted his writing and even Judaism itself. I'll keep my welcome short this evening, as I know you all are excited to hear from our speaker. Thank you again for joining us. And now I would like to welcome Bill Halpern, the Haberman Institute Board Treasurer, to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Matt, and welcome to everybody joining us today from our local community in the DC metro area, and to so many more joining us across North America and beyond. We're looking forward to tonight's program, What is Philip Roth's Legacy as a Jewish Writer, with Dr. Jacques Berlinerblau. I'm Bill Halpern, Treasurer of the Haberman Institute for Jewish Studies. To those of you who are new to our program, the mission of the Haberman Institute is to provide adults with high-quality, in-depth encounters with Jewish thought, history, and culture. Tonight's lecture will certainly check all of those boxes. We invite you to learn more about our programs and classes by visiting our website, habermaninstitute.org. We have several classes starting this month, and our next lecture is on March 30th, Gods of the Upper Air, led by author Charles King on the history of the birth of cultural anthropology and the adventurous scientists who pioneered it. So on to tonight's program. Dr. Jacques Berlinerblau is currently the Harold White Professor of Jewish Civilization at the Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. He has published on a wide variety of issues ranging from secularism to religion and politics, to Jewish American fiction, to African American and Jewish American relations, and to American higher education. His published works include 35 scholarly articles and 10 books, and this academic year he is releasing 3 new books. The Philip Roth We Don't Know, Sex, Race, and Autobiography, Secularism, The Basics, and co-authored with Professor Terence Johnson, Blacks and Jews in America, An Invitation to Dialogue. Dr. Berlinerblau has written for, appeared on, or had his work discussed in the New York Times, the Washington Post, The Economist, Salon, The Guardian, and the New Republic, to name just a few. After the talk, we will open the floor to your questions, which we will accept via the Q&A function on Zoom. And with that, I want to thank you, Dr. Berlinerblau, for sharing your expertise and insight with us this evening. And the Zoom screen is now yours.
All right. Hello, everybody. Just want to make sure you can all hear me. Great. Okay, wonderful. So, hi there. One strange thing, I'm working on comedy right now, and I can't actually see my audience, so I like to read the room, but I can't read the room, so I'm going to assume everything I say is incredibly insightful and funny and witty, and you're falling out of your Zoom boxes. But if you see me squinting a bit, I'm just looking at myself, which is a very narcissistic thing to do. So I want to say thank you to the Haberman Institute for having me lecture. It's nice to be back. Special thanks to Rebecca Newman-Levy and Matt Silverman for inviting me. I want to thank my research assistant, Jillian Prashan, who is a freshman at Georgetown University, who helped me set up the slides that you're going to see, because people love slides on Zoom. That is something I've learned. Today's goal, everybody, is to think about Roth against Roth, the great writer born in 1933 and who passed away in 2018, insisted again and again that he was not a Jewish writer, nor a Jewish American writer, but an American writer. This was no small point. He hammered this idea home with truculence for decades. So I've arranged this slide for you of some examples that I found and published in my new book of Roth being asked if he was a Jewish American writer. So here's Alain Finkielkraut, who came to Georgetown about 10 years ago, gave an interesting talk. He asks Roth, are you a Jewish American writer? Roth says, it's a journalistic cliche, almost wholly devoid of context and inaccurate in the bargain. My consciousness and my language were shaped by America. I'm an American writer. Then he is asked, then at the end of his career, he gives a talk and he says, I've never conceived of myself for the length of a single sentence as an American Jewish or Jewish American writer. As a novelist, I think of myself and have from the beginning as a free American, as irrefutably American. In an earlier interview with Cynthia Haven, when told that he was a Jewish American writer, he reposted, that's a sentimental description that entirely misses the point. So we can flip screens, thank you. So what we're doing tonight is a non-Roth approved operation. He didn't want to be thought of as a Jewish American writer with a specifically Jewish legacy. We are antagonizing the master, which is precisely what scholars are supposed to do. So let me say very clearly, Philip Roth does not approve of this line of inquiry. Then again, and this brings us to our next slide, consider the last, let's go back one, please. Consider the last Roth approved line of inquiry, and that was the infamous Blake Bailey bio. And we know how that ended. So some of you might be familiar with these headlines. What I think is really important here is this was a Roth project. This was something that Roth invested at least 10 years of his life in bringing to fruition. And it all came to a spectacular, catastrophic end. So my point is, sometimes it's better to permit a little critical distance. Sometimes it's better for an author or a musician or a scholar to let themselves be criticized by cantankerous critics such as myself, because you avoid this sort of thing. So we can clear the screen and we can go back to my shining punam, if that's okay with everyone. I have a piece coming out that suggests that Blake Bailey somehow managed to do what 1,000 irate rabbis and feminists could not. Namely, I think he may have gotten Philip Roth canceled. We're going to talk about cancel culture probably in the Q&A. I think cancel culture is overdone, but I have some serious concerns about where Roth's legacy in general might be headed, and we're going to get back to that. So I want to help you tonight understand Roth as a Jewish writer. And my sincerest hope, I want to add, is that he's not canceled. Along the way, I'm going to show you some of the materials I found in the Library of Congress, because that's what scholars do. We haunt sepulchral archives for months on end. So I'm going to pull out some jewels from the archive, but I have another 2 or 3 books in me just about things that I found in the archive, but I don't think those books are ever going to come to fruition because I want to write about other things. I don't want to live a Roth engorged life. But for those of you who live in Washington, D.C., the archives are open to anyone, and it's absolutely fascinating what one might find in there. To understand Philip Roth as a Jewish writer, there are going to be 3 important dates tonight: 1959, 1969, and 1979. Let's start with 1959, and if we could put up slide 4, please. This is the year of the publication of Goodbye Columbus and 5 short stories. This put Philip Roth right into the middle of the American conversation of serious literature, somewhat unusual for a Jewish American writer, but not totally unusual. There were precursors, obviously. There was Salinger, though he wasn't as Jewish identified as Roth was. There was Herman Wouk, who we might mention a little bit later on. But 1959, Philip Milton Roth, busts onto the scene with this blockbuster, Goodbye Columbus, which is a novella or a novelette, and 5 short stories. Let's look at the titles of the short stories because I think they're really important. Many of them rankled Jews of all stripes in the United States. The 3 that rankled Jews in order of ranklement, least to most, are the following. Epstein, which is about 2 Jewish adulterers, one of whom contracts gonorrhea as he contemplates something of a Kafkaian metamorphosis. Goodbye Columbus, which depicted suburban Jews forgetting their Newark roots, embracing the American upper middle class, having premarital sex, getting fitted for diaphragms, which was wildly provocative in 1959, and generally not living a Torah-based life, I guess I might say. But I think the text that rankled the most was a not often read piece called Defender of the Faith. Defender of the Faith features Sergeant Marks, a Jew, who sends Private Grossbart, another Jew, off to die in the Pacific Theater during World War II. He does this in retaliation for the manner in which Grossbart tried to gain accommodations for himself as a Jewish soldier and avoid any actual combat. So here's the 1959 Goodbye Columbus, creates a tremendous splash, as well it should. It's really, really quite good. We could mention Conversion of the Jews, where Roth has all of his Jewish parents and students saying they accept Jesus Christ as their savior. That one was also a little problematic, but there's a sweet tone to it. Eli the Fanatic is a heartfelt engagement with the Holocaust. So he didn't get into trouble because of that one. And you can't tell a man by the song he sings. Well, about that, the less said, the better. Needless to say, these stories did not ingratiate Philip Roth to many Jewish leaders. And let's learn about those Jewish leaders, shall we? Rabbi Saul Teplitz complained that Roth constantly depicts the Jewish characters in his short stories and novels as depraved and lecherous creatures. He quoted another rabbi who wondered aloud whether for this author, the world would be a much better and happier place without Jews. Some Jewish religious leaders made careers out of anathematizing the young literary phenom from Newark. They were incensed about his treatment of Jewish subjects. The poet and author Jeremy Larner complained in 1960, Roth seeks only to cheapen the people that he writes about. He cheats himself, Larner sighed, and cheats his readers of the truth. The sports writer Harold Ribelow complained in 1963 about what I felt was a violence against Judaism on the part of the author. Likewise, the journalist Charles Engoff lamented Goodbye Columbus's almost total lack of understanding of Jewish life in America. Then in the 1960s, for those of you that know your Roth, clearly stung by this critique, Philip Roth lays low on the Jewish front. 1960 to 1969 is a very interesting period personally for Roth and also professionally because he's very quiet about the Judaism. We could discuss his famous, quote, Inquisition at Yeshiva University in 1962, but I think it's fairly well settled now that Roth misrepresented that episode. At best, he misremembered it when he revisited it a quarter of a century later in a fascinating novella called The Facts. In any case, the 1960s are the era of a couple of interesting attempts. One is Letting Go, which is a titanic, monstrous, colossal piece of work. And then there's the 1967 When She Was Good, which really isn't his finest hour, I must say. I've also pointed to 2 lesser known stories, The Good Girl and Psychoanalytic Special. None of those stories really have much to do with the Jews. So one could theorize that from 1960 to 1969, stung by criticism from other Jews, Roth decided to perhaps lay low or back away from Jewish thematics. Then comes 1969, and Roth emerges from about a decade of not really crossing swords with Jews, and he publishes the book that everyone knows. Can we please go to slide 5? There he is, Philip Roth, in that iconic picture. I wonder if that's in Newark. That must be in Newark somewhere. I'm sure 25 people here know exactly where that deli is in the Weequake section of Newark. That would be my guess. So there it is, Portnoy's complaint, 1969. With the publication of the Anything Goes Portnoy's complaint, it seemed as if Philip Milton Roth became public literary enemy #1 in the American Jewish community and beyond. Marie Sirkin unloaded on Roth as a frequently nasty writer. She accused his character, Alexander Portnoy, of being a total phony and a rebuke to all those Jews who get high grades and profess to be socially involved. Sirkin terminated her screed with an accusation that would haunt Roth for the decade. Quote, "Within the trappings of the old hat Jewish joke lurks a savage anti-Jewish stereotype, even more old hat and not at all funny." Ms. Sirkin was saying that Roth was a self-hating Jew and that he was a problem for the American Jewish community and the international Jewish community. Portnoy's complaint not only exposed an intergenerational rift between Roth and the Jewish community, for its central protagonist, Alexander Portnoy, lampooned the ignorance, hypocrisy, and Philistinism of his Jewish elders, but it triggered an ongoing series of confrontations with female writers and scholars, some of whom exemplified the burgeoning feminist consciousness of the era. Maria Manis proffered a dissent from laudatory assessments of Portnoy's complaint and charged that Roth succeeds brilliantly in generating revulsion. Manis, who had earlier sacked the comedian Lenny Bruce during one of his many run-ins with the law, accused Roth of practicing the pornographer's trade. That's a quote. She went on to complain that not only does he sit on life's toilet seat, he examines lovingly the bowl beneath. Ouch. All right, let's try and figure out what it was that set off our uncles and aunts and maybe some of you back in 1969. So if we can go to slide 6. I enjoyed working on this with my research assistant yesterday. I asked myself, what is the most infuriating passage in Philip Roth's Portnoy's complaint from a Jewish perspective? And I think this is a very, very good candidate. I'm going to read it out. If I'm enjoying myself, you should not take that as an endorsement of Roth's sentiments. Here we go. You narrow-minded schmucks. Oh, how I hate you for your Jewish narrow-minded minds, including you, Rabbi Syllable, who have for the last time in your life sent me out to the corner for another pack of Pall Mall cigarettes from which you reek. In case nobody has ever told you, it turns out that there is just a little bit more to existence than what can be contained in those disgusting and useless categories. All right, here it comes. And instead of crying over he who refuses at the age of 14 ever to set foot inside a synagogue again, instead of wailing for he who has turned his back on the saga of his people, weep for your own pathetic selves. Why don't you, sucking and sucking on that sour grape of a religion, Jew, 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 it's coming out of my ears already, the saga of the suffering Jews, do me a favor, my people, and stick your suffering heritage up your suffering. I happen also to be a human being. I wrote a piece on Roth and blasphemy laws because 10 years prior, you actually couldn't say many of the things that he was saying in Portnoy's complaint. I work in extremist fiction. I work on a lot of writers that cross the line and are often punished and occasionally murdered for their indiscretions. And I am sometimes struck by the sheer obscenity of Roth's prose. It is part of his genius, though one clearly understands why this set off so many within the Jewish community. Okay, so we've gotten ourselves to 1969. No less of an international Jewish grandee than Gershom Scholem accused Roth in Portnoy's complaint of inciting a potential pogrom. So bad was the reception. The book was immediately translated into a variety of languages. It sold, I believe, in all 15, 16 million copies. So widespread was the engagement with this text that Gershom Scholem worried it would not be good for the Jews. Meanwhile, Hannah Arendt, who had her own run-ins with Gershom Scholem over Eichmann in Jerusalem, wanted to have coffee with Roth. There's a very thin file in the Library of Congress where they try to set up a coffee. I don't know if they scheduled that particular coffee. Hannah Arendt and Philip Roth, what a conversation that must have been. All right, the period from 1969 to 1979 is fascinating in many, many respects. All right, so Portnoy's complaint makes Philip Roth as much of a household name as a serious fictionalist can possibly be in the United States. In terms of competitors, he's entered the same territory as John Updike. He's entered the same territory as Saul Bellow and maybe Bernard Malamud. He is occupying stratospheric space in terms of the grandness of his literary reputation. But if you read the subsequent novels of the period, they are mostly all commercial and critical flops. And I'm going to read the titles of some of these works. Our Gang, a satire on Richard Nixon, which I don't think is very funny at all. The Great American Novel, which in a piece for Salon magazine, I criticized for its unconscionable racism. The Breast, which is a Kafkaesque novella, which I do think is interesting, where we meet the character David Kopesh. And the most important of all, My Life as a Man. Can we see the cover of My Life as a Man? My Life as a Man is where Philip Roth experimented and failed with all the technologies, literary technologies, he would redeploy successfully in the next 25 to 30 years. So while My Life as a Man was a critical and a commercial flop, if one reads My Life as a Man, one can see everything that Roth does well subsequently, one decade later, in process, in motion, particularly a certain technique, which I will refer to as metafiction. There's also The Professor of Desire, which is somewhat better. In those works of the 70s, two things are happening. Roth's sales are more or less dwindling. He's falling off of the map, and his reputation in feminist and Jewish circles remains not particularly good. Roth was especially miffed at the Jewish community and feminists, in his words, for the awful sales of My Life as a Man, which he viewed as his most consequential work. I don't even think it went to its second print run. We have correspondences where he expresses his dismay at how poor the sales were, and he blames in part the blowback from irate Jews and from angry feminists to Portnoy's complaint as being part of the reason why the book did not achieve what he felt he should have achieved. So critically, in the 70s, Roth is being pounded. And then comes the third key date, 1979. Can we please put up slide 8? People who know their Roth, I think, know that The Ghostwriter is Roth's greatest novel. I would also put The Anatomy Lesson and The Counterlife and Indignation there, and The Facts. Those are my 5 favorite. But this is really, really a masterpiece. One thing about The Ghostwriter, and if for those of you that have never read Roth, I would actually start here. It's very short. It's one of the first novels where I think Roth actually controlled his prolix literary style, where he cut things down, and it worked really, really quite well. Why is the 1979 Ghostwriter so fascinating? Because it initiates the meta, M-E-T-A, the meta turn in his fiction. What is meta or metafiction? Metafiction is fiction about the creation of fiction itself. Fiction that refers to itself in the fiction as a work of fiction. And he had tried it in My Life as a Man, and he started refining the technique in The Ghostwriter. And by the 1985 Counterlife, it just blossoms beautifully. And an experimental novel such as The Counterlife receives significant critical acclaim and pretty robust sales. All right, we could spend 3 of these wonderful Haberman Institute sessions talking about metafiction, but let's keep it simple. Roth begins in 1979 writing novels about Jewish writers writing novels, Jewish writers who resemble Philip Roth in many uncanny ways. So he's introducing this technique of metafiction, and he's also later going to introduce a technique of autofiction, which is like a cousin, which is when a writer uses their own name within the fiction, or the writer's name appears within the story world. All right, so let's understand the ghostwriter. While I'm reading my prepared paragraphs, you might want to look over Judge Wapter's 10-point screed directed at Nathan Zuckerman, and then we'll talk about how autobiographical that is. It was in the ghostwriter that Roth began to revisit the psychic pain that he experienced after the publication of Goodbye Columbus and Portnoy's Complaint. Looking back in 1984 at that period of his life, he spoke of, quote, the censorious small-mindedness and shame-ridden xenophobia that I ran into from the official Jews who wanted me to shut up. As he embarked on the meta-fictional stage of his career, it became clear that he would not be shut up. Nathan Zuckerman, his alter ego in The Ghostwriter, who we first met in My Life as a Man, would be his mouthpiece. What is The Ghostwriter? The Ghostwriter is a winking Bildungsroman, which features a young Nathan Zuckerman who spends the night at the home of his idol, the highly revered, albeit nearly forgotten Jewish writer, E.I. Lonoff. The 23-year-old Zuckerman arrives at his mentor's home in emotional duress. He has been estranged from his father owing to a short story he wrote about a family inheritance dispute gone terribly awry. A nervous Doc Zuckerman, Nathan's dad, had shown the unpublished manuscript to one of Newark's most influential Jews, a certain Judge Leopold Wapter. The latter proceeded to deliver a philippic in a lengthy letter, which I've put up on the screen for you. The jurist asks young Zuckerman, what set of aesthetic values makes you think that the cheap is more valid than the noble and the slimy is more truthful than the sublime? I would look at point 7. What in your character makes you associate so much of life's ugliness with Jewish people? I mean, this is just a buffet. Point 3, do you practice Judaism? If so, how? If not, what credentials qualify you for writing about Jewish life for national magazines? Wapter was just getting into gear. He terminates his inquisition with this question. Can you honestly say, Nathan Zuckerman, that there is anything in your short story? It wasn't even a published short story, folks, right? So it was just a draft that Judge Wapter had gotten his hands on. Can you say that there is anything in your short story that would not warm the heart of a Julius Streicher or Joseph Goebbels? It does not seem a coincidence that Marie Serkin, who I mentioned earlier, invoked Streicher's name in her Jeremiad about Portnoy's Complaint. Zuckerman's resolution of the psychological agony that the twin scowls of the paternal and legal authorities create is to conjure up a remarkable fantasy about marrying, of all people, I hope you're all seated, Anne Frank. Yes, that Anne Frank. I can't see your reaction, so I hope some of you have fallen out of your Zoom boxes. Through a narrative twist too detailed to mention here, Nathan Zuckerman convinces himself that unbeknown to the world, Anne Frank survived the Nazi death camps and made her way to the United States. She was living in a remote corner of Western Massachusetts, and served as the archivist and lover of Professor E.I. Lonoff. In one of the most dramatic passages in all of Roth's fiction, young Zuckerman emotes vindictively as he ponders the possibilities of marrying this saint of Jewish suffering. So let me set this up for you. He sees this woman who reminds him of Anne Frank. He has a fantasy, which he writes about, that she's Anne Frank, and he tries to explain how she got to the United States. And then he imagines that he's married her. And this brings us to chapter 4. I'm obviously doing great violence to the complexity of the original, but I think you're talking to the world's leading expert on chapter 3 of The Ghostwriter. I'm going to say that. No one knows more than me about that 3rd chapter. So this is what I would like to bring to your attention in my capacity as an expert on chapter 3. Zuckerman in chapter 4 says the following: to be wed somehow to you, Anne Frank, I thought, my unassailable advocate, my invulnerable ally, my shield against their charges of defection and betrayal and reckless, heinous informing. Oh, marry me, Anne Frank. Exonerate me before my outraged elders of this idiotic indictment, heedless of Jewish feeling, indifferent to Jewish survival, brutish about their well-being. Who dares to accuse of such unthinking crimes the husband of Anne Frank? Whoa, okay, so I hope everyone's just having a stiff drink. You're gonna need another one in a moment after reading that. Zuckerman created a fantasy in which to vindicate the anger he created within the Jewish community. He marries Anne Frank. That'll show him. Why do we refer to this as meta? In 1979, Roth found an ingenious way to, one, engage with Jewishness, two, display true empathy with the suffering of the Jewish people, and three, most importantly, keeping the entire operation in the realm of high art while being a sort of a wise guy. Roth denied being a Jewish American writer, as we saw earlier, and my suspicion is that he always associated the term Jewish American writer with middle brow art. Here's a letter from the archives to Rabbi Rachman, April 30th, 1959. Roth writes to the rabbi who had criticized him, I resent the notion that only crystal pure Jewish images must be shown to the world, even in fiction. That's a private letter in the Library of Congress. Could it be that when Roth heard the phrase Jewish American writer, he associated it with aesthetic values he deplored? In the 1961 speech, Some New Jewish Stereotypes, Roth eviscerates Leon Uris and Harry Golden for producing uncritical, feel-good pastoral pap for the least self-reflective of the Jewish people. To Roth's ear, Jewish American writer might have connoted a hack peddling tribal uplift. This links with his critique of orthodoxy. His traditionalist critics, Roth charged, generally Orthodox rabbis, assume that art by Jews should celebrate, but never challenge or criticize Judaism. Okay, what did Roth do in The Ghostwriter? He practiced In My Life as a Man in 1974, and in 1979, he engaged this technique of meta. By meta, I meant he was writing about his own personal dilemma as a writer dealing with sensitive Jewish content. I mean, come on, Anne Frank, he was playing with fire, but it worked spectacularly. The reviews, as I counted them, were 75% to 25% positive. Now, because Philip Roth is Philip Roth, there's always something more sinister in the background. In those days that I spent buried away in the salt mines of the Library of Congress, I came across this. This is slide 9, ladies and gentlemen. Let me explain to you very quickly. In The Ghostwriter, it turns out that Anne Frank is not Anne Frank. And Nathan Zuckerman acknowledges he made a mistake. My bad. She wasn't Anne Frank. I found variants, however, in which she was Anne Frank, many variants, and they're really quite fascinating. I hope somebody publishes them someday. So this comes to you fresh from the archives. The black bolding is not me, that's Roth. He wanted something to not be read. I am not going to, my sense of decency prevents me from reading this out loud, but in this version, Nathan Zuckerman and Anne Frank, the Anne Frank, have a failed sexual assignation in a motel somewhere in the Berkshire. So I'm just going to leave it at that. There it is. It's in the Library of Congress. I can give you the box number if you're so interested. Roth embraced meta. Again, he wrote fiction about a Jewish fiction writer trying to write fiction about Jewish issues. This metafictional move, and we can clear the screen, this metafictional move was his portal to about 15 years of engagement with Jewish issues in a way that the majority of the Jews really, really liked. And these are some of his great books that engage with Jewish problematics. The 80s were really the high point of his literary powers. The Anatomy Lesson, which I personally feel is one of his best works and never gets its due. The Prague Orgy, which was originally in the Zuckerman-bound trilogy, which is about going back to Prague and rediscovering the influence of Kafka. and it does intertext again with Anne Frank. Zuckerman Unbound, similar problematics. The Counterlife, which is the breakthrough for Philip Roth, which starts to deal with the question of Israel and Jewish identity in the diaspora, and 1993's Operation Shylock, where he combines metafiction with autofiction, because the name of the central protagonist is Philip Roth. By the time Roth got around to the American trilogy in the late 1990s, he was the Jewish American writer par excellence, thus supplanting Herman Wouk, Henry Roth, Cynthia Ozick, J.D. Salinger, Joseph Heller, Saul Bellow, Bernard Mallamed, you name it. Roth had become Hamelech, right? He had become the king of Jewish letters. And by the time he wrote The Plot Against America in 2003, 2004, he was Jewish American literature personified. Even Commentary Magazine, his old nemesis, was writing nice things about him. Philip Roth had become the establishment. Okay, we can clear the screen. Let's start winding it down. Meta saved Philip Roth among the Jews and among those who practiced in the high literary arts. So much so that in this lecture, as I planned it, I realized that I had always assumed that meta was a Jewish thing. I started thinking about Lenny Bruce, Larry David, Jerry Seinfeld, all of whom refer to the work of art that they're creating as they create the work of art. And then I asked myself a question, well, is there a meta moment in the Hebrew Bible? Is there a meta moment in the rabbinic writings? There are a few, but not many. So my assumption had always been, if you're doing meta, you're engaged in a Jewish aesthetic, but that probably needs to be interrogated a bit more on my part, and this is not the place to look into what I would call the mosaic meta. This is a good place to stop and discuss the legacy of Roth as a Jewish writer. His legacy as a writer, without the Jewish adjective, was threatened last year by the aforementioned Blake Bailey crisis. I have discussed his legacy as a writer in my recent book. We'll put a cover up and at slide 11. And yes, that is what you think it is. We had to kind of cover it up, but the folks at University of Virginia Press really liked that image, so we went with it. But we wanted to sanitize it a little bit. A lot of Roth's friends, he had many friends who were artists, very gifted draftspersons like Philip Guston and Kitaj, and they would draw him as a phallus symbol for some reason, which I don't fully understand. So Roth, in this book, I pointed out that Roth's legacy was not particularly assured because a deceased writer's commercial longevity is vulnerable to many fickle factors, and pure aesthetic merit is usually not one of them. Whether Roth's literary afterlife will resemble the endless confetti drop of adulation he experienced during his earthly existence is an open question. But my research in this book, and you'll notice sex, it was originally called Me Too, Race and Autobiography. I talk about how younger readers are engaging with Roth. My research suggests that regardless of the Bailey affair, there are reasons to be doubtful. To begin with, the audience for serious fiction is dwindling, and Roth himself had brought this to our attention. In 2004, he predicted that in 20 or 25 years, people won't read novels at all. The book, he sighed, in 2009 can't compete with the screen. Literature will soon be consumed by only a small group of people. Maybe more people than now read Latin poetry. Unfortunately, I think Roth was onto something in that the literary word cannot compete with the screen, and clearly market share is dwindling. During his life as a writer, Roth was very fearful about what would happen to fiction itself. All right, now we have to get to the secondary question about Roth as a Jewish writer. What will his legacy be as a Jewish writer, and what will his legacy be for Judaism? His legacy is going to be cross-pressured by a few variables. Here's one. There are, of course, exceptions, but after decades of teaching Roth's fiction, and I mean decades, I was teaching him at Brooklyn College in 1994, I find this generation of students to be uniquely impervious to Roth's pervy charms. His core constituency, and I wish I could see the Zoom screen right now, is composed of mostly white liberals who came of age in the 1960s and 1970s. One needn't consult actuarial tables to understand why this demographic cannot and will not sustain his sales for much longer. If we see Roth as a great chronicler of post-World War II liberal Jewish identity, and if we see liberal Judaism as currently embarking on its own uncertain demographic path, then his commercial longevity is clearly in question. In a way, Roth's legacy as a Jewish writer is predicated on the legacy of the art-loving, freedom of speech-loving, mischief-loving Judaisms that supported him, the so-called liberal denominations. Put differently, if liberal Judaism prospers, there's a likelihood that we'll be reading Roth in 50 or 60 years. If ultra-Orthodoxy, which is the fastest growing demographic within Judaism, continues to expand, I think it's highly unlikely that they'll be reading Roth in 50 or 60 years. But what remains as a fact on the ground is the work, and who knows if posterity will or will not embrace it. But the themes of Jews as curious, cantankerous, self-critical, and ultra self-conscious, or meta, will always remain. So as pessimistic as I am about the legacy of Philip Roth in the literary circles and in Jewish circles, I still think that he has produced a body of work that is worthy of our scrutiny, and it's worthy of professors and scholars such as myself to go out and defend that work and explicate to you what its treasures are, what its advantages are, and of course, what its disadvantages and demerits might be as well. With that said, I had a lot of fun preparing that. I learned a lot. We have a lot of time for Q&A. And as I always tell my students, you judge a scholar by the way they respond to questions, not by their prepared speeches. So have at it, everybody. Let's go. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Dr. Berlinerblau. And as you just said, everyone out there, please go ahead now and send more questions. We have some coming in now, but the more the better. So thank you for such a fascinating lecture introduction here to our continuing story about Philip Roth. I want to go back first to maybe what you opened with at the beginning, that about Philip Roth's biography. And so this question here is, Philip Roth wouldn't be worried about criticizing or characterizing anyone else. Why did he think himself beyond characterization by others?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So let me rephrase it a little bit. He was absolutely savage in taking the personal lives of his friends and lovers and transposing them onto the page. He did this with reckless abandon. He even commented on it in a very meta way. His characters often will say, please don't do this, you're a cannibal. Stop splaying me on the page. I'm a private person. Yet Roth would not permit a similar process. He would not subject himself to a similar process. Roth had a maniacal and I think very flawed desire to control his public self-image. And this is what led to the explosion, I feel, with Bailey. He had been doing this throughout his career. A person so brilliant, so insightful about human nature, for a person of that intelligence to have not understood how fruitless such an operation might be. We cannot control what people say about us, or we can only act in life and we can only pray, right? Roth tried to exert maniacal control over his biography and his public perception, and it failed, and it backfired, and it, even before the Bailey fiasco, it rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. They felt they were dealing with some sort of juggernaut, a commercial enterprise, right? A spaceship, something really, really big that you could never approach or touch or caress, right? Or find a vulnerable spot. It was only Roth that would present these aspects of his character. And I would attribute that to his fundamental narcissism.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much for that answer. There's a good number of questions coming in now. One question that I saw here is about what, Philip Roth, what did he have? What were his belief systems and such about Judaism? What was his relationship to Judaism?
Yeah, I think the text would be Alan Cooper, Philip Roth, and the Jews. There are writers that have canvassed that more thoroughly than I, but I'm more than happy to render an opinion. Roth was very much a cultural Jew, or what we would call a secular Jew. And as you know, I work on secularism. He had a deep personal affiliation with Judaism, though I would describe his affiliation as something along the lines of what we see in secular humanistic and Reconstructionist Judaism. It's an affiliation based on peoplehood and shared culture, as opposed to Torah and Talmudic wisdom. One thing that's really interesting about Roth is how infrequently he cited the Hebrew Bible and almost never the rabbinic canon. Very, very, very little from any sort of rabbinic writings, right? Maybe a little something in Operation Shylock. Some have argued he wasn't really Jewishly literate. He didn't know his biblical Hebrew, and he didn't know his rabbinics, and he didn't know about medieval Spain, right? I think that might be a little bit harsh. I'll say this: Roth just wasn't interested in those thematics and problematics. For him, Judaism was mom and dad. It was Newark. It was Weequake. It was his grandfather, Sender. And then it became the anti-Semitism that his parents encountered. And then in the 80s, as he starts to write about it, Judaism became the fate of Israel, the irony of the existence of the state of Israel, and the absolute necessity that the state of Israel must continue to exist. So as a Jewish writer, he was physically a Jew. He wrote about Jews, but I don't think there was a tremendous body of wisdom about Judaism in his writing, and that's fine, right? He never claimed to be a chacham or a scholar of Judaism. So I'd say his Jewish erudition was sort of limited.
Great, thank you very much. There's a number of questions about some of the different books that you didn't mention. I don't know if I'll mention a couple here to see if you have any thoughts. But one person wrote if you had thoughts on patrimony and thoughts about the plot against America. Just to name a couple of them at the moment.
Well, that's a great way. I mean, every Roth book is just a universe, and you can get sucked into that cannibal galaxy and never appear, right? There's just so much going on in each of these novels. Patrimony is a popular sentimental favorite. It's not my personal favorite because I find it to be a very aggressive and mean book because of the way Roth exposes certain components of his father's life, again, cannibalizes his father's life and his father's lingering death in ways that I don't think his father would have liked very much. I don't know. I didn't know his father. I certainly wouldn't like to write about my father that way, and I wouldn't want my sons to write about me that way. One thing I warn you about Patrimony is if you teach it in a literature course, folks, it's a work of literature. It reads like this heartfelt biography. And I think that's an amateur reading of what's going on there. There's a lot of meta in that book. There are dream sequences. There are textured narratives that suggest Roth knows that what he's doing is deeply, deeply morally wrong and compromised, right? There are Oedipal scrums going on throughout the text. So I always say, professors, we're here for a reason. And one of the reasons we're here is to guide you through this work. I would just caution readers against reading Patrimony with total sentimentality and syrup and sugar. It's something far nastier. It's a mean operation, and it's a pretty interesting piece of work. Plot Against America was Roth's last big, great seller. It reintroduced him to the literary commercial marketplace after some uneven sales. It's an interesting work. What will I say about it? It goes on way too long. It's very meta in the sense that we don't quite know where the story is coming from. My deepest insight for you on Plot Against America is many people say, oh, Philip Roth, he prophesied Trump, he prophesied Trump. During the day, they said, oh, he prophesied Bush. he prophesied Bush. That's not what Philip Roth prophesied. And Roth had the prophetic in him, without a doubt. What Roth understood was the existence of a certain type of white Christian nationalist thinking. And that's why that novel is very, very important for me as a historical artifact. Roth saw very clearly that this dimension of American history was alive and well and had a beating heart and could reemerge, and lo and behold, it did. So I think Plot Against America stands the test of time rather well.
Great, thank you. A number of people in our audience have read these novels at different times in their lives, and so like one person noted that they were turned off by Portnoy when they were much younger, and then when they were older, they laughed their way through it. And I'm just wondering if you want to react to that first of all, and then also if there's any other books or novels that you would recommend our audience rereading, maybe at this time in their lives, that they would have a different outlook on from when they were at a younger age.
Sure. So what's happening with Portnoy for me is the opposite. When I first read it in graduate school in the 90s, I couldn't stop laughing. A lot of people read passages out loud when they like something. You hip your friends to it. I find Portnoy to be kind of unreadable now. Maybe someone on the board will say, oh, Berlinerblau, he's too woke, he's too this, he's too that. There are just some sections of Portnoy that I'm not comfortable with. Maybe that makes me too much of a tree hugger or a snowflake. But more importantly than my reaction, my students don't laugh. When I taught that at Brooklyn College in 1994, I mean, the room was laughing. And maybe there was one kid that didn't find it funny. And in 2000, when I got to Georgetown, 2005, 3/4 of the room was laughing, right? 2017, when I taught Portnoy's Complaint, there was almost a classroom insurrection, all right? And I don't want to be this person that castigates the youth and talks about how dumb they are, and they're not dumb. On the contrary, they're just a different generation with a different sensibility. So a lot of Roth's work that people enjoy in the privacy of their own home, and it should be published and it should be out there, the young generation is not vibing with it. The young generation doesn't like it. They feel deeply, deeply uncomfortable with it. So Portnoy's Complaint and Sabbath's Theater are the two novels that are very hard to teach in a college setting nowadays. And I would urge folks out there, I know we might have a larger audience, to not see that as some type of fascist, tyrannical impulse. There are certain things about Roth's writing which are really off-putting, and there are many things about Roth's writing which are sublime. And it's the job of the critic to help us kind of understand what is what. And that is the way I understand his body of work.
Thank you. To sort of continue the theme, there's a number of questions about the, people are asking for a little more information on the Bailey affair and why he might be canceled because of it. And maybe that links to what you also just said about his material itself.
Sure. So the Bailey affair, first of all, it's really unfortunate and it's really sad. It involves human beings. So it involves traumatized human beings. So I don't want to turn this into a kind of shtick about the Bailey affair. What I think happened in the immediate aftermath of the Bailey affair was many in the media who had been Roth's friends got caught sort of with their hands in the cookie jar, right? So the Bailey book comes out to a rollout that probably hasn't been seen in literary publishing in the Anglo world in decades, right? I mean, every major magazine, every major critic is marshaled to talk about the Bailey affair. And, let's point fingers. The New Yorker and the New York Times, right? Or just basically PR appendages, right, of Roth's work via Bailey. And then the scandal hits at the worst possible time, maybe 4 or 5 weeks into the run of the book. And all of those who are celebrating Roth and celebrating Bailey are now finding that they are in a very unpopular place, right? And Roth inadvertently gets dragooned into Bailey's vortex. So my friends in the literary world issued a rather chilling warning to me I had one friend, a journalist, I'll not mention where, who said, Jacques, nobody wants to touch Roth now. And I was like, but that's very unfortunate because I have this book coming out. Yeah, I would hope. Yeah. So the silence that one hears right now is the silence of all of Roth's media buddies, and he had them everywhere. One of the great things I learned in the archives, everybody, was how hard Roth hustled. I wrote a piece in The Guardian about this. He really worked it, as an artist should. And he had friends everywhere in high places, on the arts pages, on the op-ed pages, right? So what you'll see is like a ground stop after May, June, once the Bailey affair washes out, right? Though the victims remain traumatized, right? But once the affair moves to the back pages, and there's a lot more to be said about this, by the way, as Joe Livingston of the New Republic said, the Bailey affair has tendrils that reach into every structural level of literary publishing in the United States and media, right? There's much, much more to this story than just the alleged crimes of Bailey, right? So how a writer was lionized, aggrandized, hyped, sold to Americans. And I think people are starting to recognize that about Philip Roth. So we're coming up on the 1-year anniversary of the Bailey affair, and my own fairly scientific study indicates there's been more or less radio silence from the major organs of culture about Roth since the Bailey affair. So this is why I venture that the Bailey affair wasn't good for Roth. But if you read me carefully, I think the trends were going down for a good 10, 15 years. You could see that Roth's legacy was going to be very problematic even before there was the scandal with Blake Bailey.
As a follow-up to that, there's a question on the human stain, which this person says foreshadowed cancel culture. So if you have any response to that book and cancel culture from the.
Okay, let's fight. It foreshadowed the way like old white guys see cancel culture, right? And so human stain has many great aspects to it. Sure, it reached into an experience which Roth himself was having. Now, we know that Roth in the 90s, especially around Bard College, would go and give lectures, and he was kind of seeing what I'm seeing at Georgetown. He was seeing a lot of students that were not mesmerized by the master and were having great difficulty with his fiction. My view is that's a professor's job, not an author's job. It's the professor's job to listen to students and hear their complaints about a writer, and then say that's absolutely valid. And now let's look at what's great about this writer. So a writer talking about his or her own writing is always a very problematic operation. I think your questioner raises a good point. That was an episode in cancellation where Dean Coleman Silk is canceled at Athene College in the Berkshires for an off-the-cuff remark about using a racial slur, right? One thing though, whenever I teach human stain to my students in my Blacks and Jews course, right? The consensus of the African-American students is always the same. There is no way an African-American character, such as Coleman Silk, who is passing as a Jew, would not know that that word, spooks, excuse me, was a racial slur. It is simply impossible that any African-American would have thought that that word simply meant ghost, right? So, yeah, the human stain presaged it. The human stain is the first time I think Roth seriously thinks about race without trying to make jokes and without trying to create literary minstrelsy scenes. So I appreciate it for that. And your questioner is correct. Roth sees something coming in American higher education. I just don't think Roth was correct in the moral trajectory of his critique. I just disagree with him for my own personal reasons, and we can explore that if the questioners want to.
Great, thank you. About a question in a little bit of a different direction here. This question is from someone who is a Jewish liberal comic in New York City. I'll read part of it itself here. I think that a lot of themes that Roth touches on are still very relevant. Do you think that maybe he will continue to have an influence in the comedic sphere as opposed to the literary sphere? He says, I ask because many Jewish American Israeli comics I've worked with are very self-critical in their material.
Really great question. I appreciate that question. Yeah, I'm working on comedy now. I think this meta moment, this talking about your pain as an artist within your own work of art, which we've referred to as metafiction, this is precisely what Dave Chappelle does in his act. He's been doing this for years. And for those of you that know The Closer, another nominee for cancellation, he spends The Closer making jokes about the very experience that he experienced as a guy making jokes about the LGBTQ community. What does that remind you of, folks? Right? That's Philip Roth's meta. That's what Roth was doing in Ghost Rider and Anatomy Lesson and Zuckerman. He was creating alter egos to probe at the fury and the rage that his literature created in the Jewish community, right? Chappelle is clearly influenced by that meta technique. In fact, I see it in comedians like Kathy Griffin. I see it in comedians like Louis C.K. You get involved in a scrum, the audience gets mad, which is really easy in the age of digital media. You write about it, you make it part of your act, right? In terms of Roth's comic chops, we know that the guy was hysterically funny. He was a total crack up with his friends. I teach a course on comedy writing. Comedy writing is not stand-up. I want to be very clear about that, right? Comedy writing is so much harder to be funny when you write than when you're doing stand-up, because you've got no visual, you don't have a body, you don't have a presence, you don't have a physical audience in front of you, you don't have a bunch of drunks, right, that are kind of cheering you on to say the dumbest imaginable thing. So Roth as a comic writer is really, really gifted, right? One of the best comic writers of the 20th century, and there are not many. His most recent descendant, I hope I can give you all a good book recommendation, is Paul Beatty, Beatty, in The Sellout. If you want to see kind of Roth transmogrified into an African-American context with a person with a totally different sensitivity, obviously, but the same ambition to use the written word to just crack you up and shake you up and existentially knock you over, I would advise that all of you check out the very great Paul Beatty and his Man Booker winning work, the 2015 The Sellout.
Thank you. Yeah, I thought, given you mentioning the comedy piece, I thought that one would relate to your own experience. So I appreciate that. Another person asked, you mentioned, I guess, the sort of Philip Roth's longevity in the Jewish community. Do you have any thoughts on what his non-Jewish audience and longevity in that going forward?
Yeah, these are great questions. Thank you, everybody. His readership in the United States were mostly white ethnics, I noticed, right? So a lot of Italian Americans, Polish Americans. He wasn't read much in the Latinx community. He wasn't read much in the African American community. That's when I kind of realized Roth had a bit of a problem when I started teaching Roth to African American students. So in terms of his readership, the growth areas for Roth readership are Germany, France, Italy, Spain, Mexico, Portugal. That's where a lot of Roth work is being translated, right? Not all of his oeuvre has been translated. That's where I see the growth as occurring. However, in my book, I want to argue that there's a timeless theme in Roth that should be of tremendous interest to this generation. And that theme is the human capacity for radical transformation. And this is something that Roth has been blasting away at since his very first short story, the 1952 Box of Truths, until his very last novel, the 2009 Nemesis. Philip Roth was obsessed with change, with how a human being changes, often for reasons that a human being cannot fully understand or grasp, and without even knowing why or how the change is occurring. I find that theme, Matt and questioner, really resonates with this generation. They are so intrigued by that. All right, some of them are transitioning genders, right? Some of them are really perplexed by our workplace and how it locks people into a job, tenure, right? For like 40, 50 years. And the idea that they can relentlessly change and reinvent themselves. It's not a new theme, by the way, but it's something that Roth always seems to talk about. His characters are in a constant state of flux, as he himself says. So flux, I would buy flux stocks if I were everyone here, right? Flux is something that people like to read about. One of the chapters in the book is called Go Flux Yourself, because I feel Roth's advice to his readership, especially his Jewish readership, is you're just so boring. Do something, like shake it up, man. Like make yourself different, right? Be a version of you that you dreamed of being. And the kicker is, and you'll probably be miserable for the endeavor, but do it anyhow, because that's how a person makes themselves into a work of art, right? So the idea of making oneself into a work of art through radical transformation is very Rothian. I know we're in a Jewish context, so let me add one more thing. Roth believes Jews have a unique skill for self-transformation and communal transformation. He talks about Zionism as this great project of communal transformation. Who would have thought, right, that the far-flung and dispossessed Jews would create Israel, right? That is communal transformation in a Rothian register, and it's a theme he really, really cannot let go of. He explores it in so many different ways, and most importantly, that has a future amongst this reading audience. Kids like that theme, I've noticed.
Thank you. Yes, you just mentioned Israel, and there's somebody just asked the question about if you have any thoughts on readership in Israel and sort of.
Yeah, a lot of his stuff is translated in Israel. I haven't spent much time recently speaking to Israeli intellectuals. I think he will always have his liberal Tel Aviv readership who will always greatly admire him. His problematic, I mean, his two great novels about Israel are The Counterlife and Operation Shylock. And the binaries there have probably grown a lot more problematic. So historically, they're probably not of interest in a geopolitical sense. They are of interest in terms of Jewish identity and how Jews wrestle with being on top, with having their own sovereign nation state. I don't quite know what the reception is of Roth. It's not generally a good time anywhere on earth for a dead white male writer right now. And maybe that's okay, all right? Is there anybody on this board that dares say Philip Roth did not get his due, right? He was robbed, right? He didn't get the Nobel Prize. I'll grant you that, right? But can anybody say that this writer never received the legitimate praise and adulation and flowers that he merited as a great, he did. So maybe it's time to move on. I would say politely, humbly, maybe we should start exploring or rediscovering other voices. So I'll say the same about Roth in Israel, though I don't know enough about it, that it's probably going to mirror his trajectory in the United States over the next 20 or 30 years. People are looking for other voices in fiction.
Great, thank you. And so this next question, I'm going to ask a kind of might be a moot question in the grand scheme of things, given what you just said. But there's a number of people who have asked about the film adaptations and why film adaptations, I guess, haven't they different people said they're not very good, and one person notes maybe it's sort of this meta structure of his writing that affects it. But given what you just said, there may not be any opportunities for future movies on the screen. But if you have any thoughts about his the films, I mean,
these are really good questions, first of all. So thank you to everyone out there, and they're knowledgeable questions, because your audience knows that I call it the Dr. Zhivago effect. So you had Boris Pasternak, right, who had a nice life, right, and then out comes Dr. Zhivago, and everybody's reading Boris Pasternak, right? That's not going to happen with Philip Roth. He's not going to experience the Dr. Zhivago effect, because so many of his books had already been made into movies while he was alive. And second, so many of those movies were commercial and critical flops. In fact, all of them were. I would signal, if you're interested, I thought Indignation was actually okay. There's a version made of The Dying Animal called Elegy, which brings some more complicated feminist dynamics into its cinematography, which is all right. And basically all the rest of them are kind of a disaster. Why is that? Your very smart questioner asked that question. Why is that? Roth is one of those deep consciousness writers. He takes you way deep into a human being's interiority, right? Be it the narrative voice or be it the central protagonist, right? His skill, one of his many skills as a writer, is to just get you so down in there with your, that is the pleasure and the aesthetic experience of reading Roth. Cinema can't do that, right? Voiceovers in cinema are always weird, if you ask me, right? Cinema is very visual. There's reams of scholarly literature on literary to cinematic adaptations and vice versa, and why they're so difficult, right? Because we're really dealing with different currencies and different languages. But to make it really brief, no, his films have not been successful. There's no Dr. Zhivago that I know of. If I were given a huge budget and asked to direct something, I would direct The Ghostwriter, and I would cast myself in the role of Hope Lonoff, the wife of E.I. Lonoff, because she steals the show, all right? So that might be a controversial casting decision for a variety of reasons, right? But The Ghostwriter, in fact, was adapted for the stage, and there was a British version of it in the 80s, which I don't think fared so well. But I think The Ghostwriter, because it's so short and succinct, could possibly have a go as a feature film. But again, I wouldn't put stock in any of that, and I wouldn't invest in cinematic Roth futures.
Great, then thank you. I have at least 3 questions here on American Pastoral. 2 of them are general thought, general questions about what you think. One of them is more specific. I can read it and you can incorporate it in if you feel like it's relevant. Do you feel that Mary's motivation to terrorism was an implicitly stated hate of her appearance and perceived mother's rejection rather than her political views? Yeah,
boy, Mary Lvov, what a character. Either I said it or another scholar said it. So I don't know who said it. Maybe it was me. I think Mary Lvov is Roth's way of thinking about the Jewish radical left. I think it was me, actually. So Mary Lvov, this character that blows up a post office and then kind of we talked about change, right? How many identities does Mary Lvov go through, right? She goes through being daddy's little girl, to being a Vietnam War activist, to being a terrorist, to being a Jain, Jain, a practitioner of the Jain faith, right? She doesn't exist. I think that also should be mentioned. This is meta-fiction, right? She's not real. Within the story world, she's not real. So I think Roth grew up pincered between communists and liberals. And the liberals are represented by his hardworking parents who loved America and loved FDR. But in his world, there were a lot of Jewish communists and anarchists and troublemakers, the types of folks that we've written out of our collective American Jewish history, even though every single person here has a Bubi and Zaidi who was a Red. I know that. All right, don't try to deny it, everyone. We know we all have these people in our families, but we've written them out of our collective story as American Jews because we're embarrassed. We're deeply embarrassed. A similar process has occurred with African Americans who also had a dalliance with communism, and those stories just aren't, the Robeson stories and Ralph Ellison's communist period and Langston Hughes' communist period. We don't talk about that, right? Because communism is communism. Anyhow, I think in the figure of Mary, Roth was looking at like the Rosa Luxemburgs of the world, right? And he was recognizing that this was almost part of the genome of Judaism, right? That this anger in the name of social justice, this righteous anger, coupled with a good Jewish brain, right, led to a sort of madness that induced violence. That's my take on who Mary Lvov is. She's a generic Jewish left character that Roth wrestled with as a child. He met lots of these folks, as we know from Portnoy's complaint, as we know from the facts. These people were streaming in and out of his lives, right? They were very radical. We see such a character in Plot Against America, Alvin, the cousin, right, who goes to fight for Canada because the United States won't fight Hitler in that parallel universe. Roth was intrigued and repulsed by radical left-wing Jews. And I think Mary Lvov was his way of performing a seance and like bringing them up and thinking about them and then sort of writing them out of the story.
Great, thank you. There's a question here. I mean, asking if this is more of an abstract question for you, but if Philip Roth was, coming out with works today, and sort of like what would he think of the literary profession today and Twitter and sort of the world that we live in now?
He wouldn't like it. And as a person that is in middle age and getting older, I don't want to be that guy. I don't want to be the old guy that doesn't like everything that young people do, because this was done to Philip Roth when he was a young writer, right? When he was a young writer, he was excoriated for the way he spoke and the way he used the jittery cadences, as he called it, of the English language. So I think Roth would be incensed. He was approximating the curmudgeon role in the final 10, 15 years of his life. You would see these kinds of sour, churlish indictments of the culture. It's a very natural thing. It's particularly pronounced with Jewish men as they get older. And I just personally don't want to be that Jewish man. And I hope I'm not the only Jewish man on this, but I just feel this kind of reflexive dislike of the youth and what the youth are doing is a bit of a cliche. Unfortunately, Roth, to answer the question, Roth didn't like the screen. He thought it was a threat to the written word. He would have hated Twitter, 140 characters. Wow, 140 characters. You can't do anything in 140 characters. So no, Roth was not at ease with the culture. I'm more intrigued by writers who get old and they love all the new stuff, right? I think Sartre, Jean-Paul Sartre, at the end of his life, threw his lot in with the 68 revolutionaries. He was like an old guy at the time, right? And he kind of like reinvigorated himself by looking at what young people were doing and not casting aspersions on their activism. So no, Roth was not that person. He would not be in a comfort zone. He was ruining the demise of literature 25 years ago. And he generally had a very negative assessment of the species in general, I would add, right? So he was a curmudgeon and we love him for that. And that was his thing, but it doesn't mean he was right. I guess that's what I'm trying to say.
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate that sense of, later generations really, loving what the younger generations are doing now is a nice reflection. I have a couple of questions here about the misogyny in Philip Roth's work, to take us in another different direction here. What are your thoughts on that? Is it one person's asking, many women are offended by even the thought of Philip Roth, and so are these legitimate reactions? And
all reactions are legitimate reactions, and those are particularly legitimate reactions. And those reactions are so legitimate. I spent 3 chapters in this book, which is almost half of the book, thinking about Roth, the Me Too moment, and the accusations of misogyny. It would be better to read the text for the questioner, but long story short, I'm trying to figure out if Philip Roth's fiction was misogynist. I try and say what I don't know is if Philip Roth was a misogynist in real life. We needed a biographer to figure that out for us, right? And I don't think we got the biography from Blake Bailey that would help us work through that question. Ira Nadel, my colleague Ira Nadel, wrote a lovely biography of Philip Roth where I think he gets a lot closer to that question. I'll put this thought in your mind. Philip Roth did something which I find really misogynistic and uncool, if you will. He had a very bad habit of taking ex-wives, former lovers, spurned girlfriends, and putting them into the fiction rather brutally. In today's parlance, that would be called revenge porn. And I'm using those words fully understanding what I'm saying. I find the operation immoral. I find the operation despicable because these women often were dead and they couldn't defend themselves. And what I'm noticing is that the feminist critics that started blasting him in the 70s might not have known they might not have known that he was doing this, but they felt it. And that's why they were so irate and just negative about Roth's fiction, because even though they didn't know that he was bringing his wife, Margaret Martinson Williams, into novel after novel and drubbing her and smashing her and humiliating, right? They felt it as readers, right? They felt an operation was being conducted in this text that was kind of mean and nasty and vitriolic. So I do try to defend Roth from some charges of misogyny in chapter 4, I believe, right? Where I point to things he wrote that nobody seems to read anymore, which really show a kind of progressive way of thinking about women's sensibilities, right? At least for a dude in the 1960s. However, that operation of constantly dragooning ex-lovers, ex-wives, girlfriends into one's fiction against their will strikes me as deeply immoral and misogynistic. So it's a little bit of both.
Thank you. On that note, I have a question here about the racism in the Great American Novel. This person notes who was no different from the treatment of Jews in some of the other books. So do you think that's why this is a totally enjoyable and fascinating book, but doesn't seem to get read anymore?
First of all, I would disagree that the Great American Novel is a totally enjoyable and fascinating book. One, because I don't like baseball. I like soccer. I like football. I play tennis. I think my tennis partner is watching. Partners. The Great American Novel is a funny piece of work, folks. Very few people have read it. You read that book unaware that suddenly Roth is going to go like the full Joseph Conrad and take us into Africa and start a kind of menagerie of racist stereotypes, which I'm deeply, deeply uncomfortable with. I want to push back on the questioner. I want us to go to a work called Deception, which Roth wrote in 1990, where two very interesting things happen in Deception. All right. One, Philip Roth, the actual Philip Roth, this is autofiction, and now you all know what that means. All right. The actual Philip Roth recounts an anti-Semitic incident he endured on the streets of London. And he's irate, and he should be irate, right? He's walking with another Jewish guy, and he's got a beard. He was rocking a beard at that period of his life. And he hears something that he doesn't like, and he gets really mad, and he has to be physically restrained by another writer from beating up a vile anti-Semite. In the exact same work, there's a scene where one of Philip Roth's Czech literary buddies goes off on a extended racist rant about his wife's African lover. And there's not a single stereotype of persons of African ancestry which is not featured in that rant. And the Philip Roth character says nothing about it. He just puts it out on the page. No fight. No, I can't believe that. So what I'm saying is there's this real double standard. You see this in the Plot Against America as well, right? Where in the chapter Loudmouth Jew, the Roths are irate about the anti-Semitism, they should be, that they encounter in Washington in 1940 or 41, I believe, or maybe even 39, all right? But by the same token, Sandy the brother starts drawing African-American bellhops because he likes the way they look, and he's just describing their bodies in ways that I'm not even comfortable sharing with you right here. So Roth had to know about the long history of painting Jewesses in the 19th century and how degrading that was, right? Where a Christian painter would find a Jewish woman and draw this exoticized, sexualized portrait of her. So no, I'm not ready to exonerate Roth from the charge of really thoughtless prose and maybe even racist prose in those works. I wrote a piece in Salon about a year ago in January, which you might all want to read, where I re-encapsulate the argument. But I do find that there is a lot to be desired, a lot not to be desired. There's a lot of problematic material vis-a-vis race in Roth's writing.
Thank you. We're coming on the last 5 minutes or so, so I want to, unfortunately, we're not going to get to all the questions, but I want to just close on a few that just to bring us together here. You mentioned earlier that your top 5 Roth books again, and so there's a couple of questions of people asking you to repeat that list, which we can also include in any follow-up email with everyone.
Absolutely. So let's do it. You got to read the Ghost Rider, folks. All right, you'll read it in 2 nights, maybe even 3, right? Maybe even 1. Then bear with me, read the anatomy lesson. It's really triggering, okay, for younger. but it is a meditation on pain as profound as any I've ever read. And if anyone on this board has actually experienced pain in their life, you're going to love this book because of the descriptions of pain and the way Roth correlates the physical pain that Jews experience with the psychic pain of the Holocaust. Really well and subtly done, right? That the central protagonist doesn't even recognize how the Holocaust has worked him over and worked over his nerves and joints and tendons, right? And reduced him. So I would put the anatomy lesson as a really special case. The Counterlife, everybody loves the Counterlife. My students love the Counterlife. It's fun to read. I love the facts because the first 30 pages are intentionally really bad. And the last 30 pages are intentionally really good, right? So what Roth did is he underwrote for about 100 pages so that he could create a finale that would knock your socks off, a showstopper, if you will, right? That's what happens at the end of the facts. That book is so clever. It's Nathan Zuckerman telling Philip Roth he can't write very well unless he uses Nathan Zuckerman as his alter ego. Last, I'm really fond of Indignation because there's finally a female heroine in there that I really think about a lot, and that's Olivia Hudden, who is mercilessly slut-shamed by all the boys at Bucknell. It's not called Bucknell, but it's supposed to be Bucknell College, including the central protagonist, who's a good guy, Marcus Messner, right? So they all fail vis-a-vis this woman and drive her to the brink of insanity and even perhaps suicide. And in its exposition of the tight, crimped mores of the 1950s, that's just a wonderful, wonderful work. So again, Ghostwriter, anatomy lesson, Counterlife, The Facts, and Indignation. And that's 5 novels, right? I mean, how many people have 5 great novels in them? There's a certain person on this board, Matt, who's going to say, Sabbath's Theater, man, that is the good stuff. Not my cup of tea. But just so you know, a lot of people really, really like Sabbath's Theater because they feel they're channeling something raw, right? And untamed in the male psyche, and Roth puts it on the page.
Great, great, thank you. Just as we close, do you have any final thoughts you want to leave us with this evening?
Yeah, I'm really, first of all, again, thank you to the people who I couldn't see. I'm so sorry I couldn't see your faces. If you want to send me an email on my website, it's jberlinerblau.com. You can contact me. I'm sorry I couldn't see your reactions, right? And I really, as a failed stand-up comedian, I need to see people's reactions to know what I'm doing. I want to urge you, I said something earlier about the older generation not reflexively castigating the younger generation. And what I found in the initial response to the book was a lot of older writers that were quite frankly not getting it, or they're not understanding what the operation is. So I'd like us to think, all of us to think a little more generously about what younger people who are not white and Jewish might think about literature and might think about Philip Roth. That's a very Jewish request that I'm making. And the thing I'll leave you with is this. Long live the professorate. I hope you liked tonight's lecture, but only a professor can do, a journalist can't do this, a biographer can't do this unless they're a scholar. With the demise of tenure in the United States and the collapse of American higher education, I actually did write a book about this, we're finding fewer and fewer people who are trained to do this and who have tenure, so they're protected to do this. And I just want you all to think about how dangerous that is. Last thing I'll say, in that movie, what was the movie with, Look Up, Don't Look Up, that one, Don't Look Up, right? There was this whole funny riff about peer-reviewed research where they're saying, was that research peer-reviewed about the meteor not hitting the Earth? And they're like, no, it wasn't peer-reviewed, but it's good research. And then the meteor hits the Earth. So what we do as scholars is we live in a world of peer-reviewed research, and it keeps us honest. And hopefully it creates that critical distance that Roth didn't want so many of his chroniclers to have. So there are many great Roth scholars, many. I would urge you to read their work, right? And they're the ones I would hope you would listen to rather than friends and family and ex-lovers of Philip Milton Roth. Thank you so much.
Great, great. Thank you. This was such a fascinating lecture full of insights, and thank you for tackling so many questions. We had over 50, I think, this evening. So there's great interest, and we'll follow up with the audience. So, and all of you out there, we'll send you an email tomorrow or the next day with any details about the program. So thank you again, Dr. Berlinerblau, and I appreciate you taking the time this evening. And thank you all out there for joining us.
Thanks. It was a lot of fun. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks. Have a good night.
Good night.
Bye.